Today I wanted to talk about this Galaxian cabinet and specifically the work I did on it to convert it from a MAME emulation cabinet back into a dedicated arcade cabinet. I'm going to talk about replacing the LCD with the CRT as well as rewiring everything in here for the Jama standard so I can run original arcade game PCBs on it. But first, here's a little bit about the cabinet's history. So before I picked up this Galaxian cabinet, I had only one other cabinet. This was a home-built MAME cabinet which had a horizontal screen and 8-way joysticks. It worked really well for a majority of 90s era two-player games, however it wasn't ideal for 80s era games like Pac-Man. Games that used vertical screens just looked too small on the horizontal screen, and games that used 4-way joysticks were difficult to play on the 8-way sticks. So I decided I wanted a second cabinet that had a vertical screen and a 4-way joystick in order to get the best experience for these horizontal 4-way games. Now, at the time I didn't have much room for arcades in my house. In fact, I was really expecting to max out at a total of 2 cabinets. So the best choice for me at that time was to go with a multi-game solution. So I decided I was going to have a cabinet that would run the MAME emulation software. I found this Galaxian cabinet on Craigslist, and structurally it was in good shape, but cosmetically it needed a fair amount of work. It had been sitting in a barn for a while and was grimy, and the side art had been painted over, but luckily there was no structural damage. Eventually I was able to clean it up, replace all the artwork, and we got it back to looking like a brand new machine. I installed a mini ITX PC motherboard, an LCD screen, and installed the MAME software running on Windows. I built a custom software front-end game launcher that had around 12 or so of my favorite vertical 4-way games loaded onto it. This worked out well for many years, but eventually I started experiencing problems with the PC hardware. It would spontaneously reboot for seemingly no reason and just had some weird issues. Around that time we moved into a larger house and ended up with more room for arcade machines. So I figured at that point it didn't really make sense to have multiple emulation machines. So this video will show the changes that I needed to make to convert the cabinet's PC-based hardware back to an original Galaxian game PCB, as well as replacing of the LCD display with a CRT. Also, I will readily admit that while I love the side art for Galaxian, I much prefer the gameplay of Galaga, so I wanted to make sure that the cabinet was able to play both of those games, but more on that later. Let's get started by unboxing a CRT. I was lucky enough to be able to find a seller on eBay that had several of these brand new old stock CRTs available. This particular model is a Weiya M2621H Type 1 21-inch monitor. I'm going to pull it out of the original packaging here so we can take a look. Since CRT production ended in the mid to late 2000s, it's unlikely I'll ever unbox a brand new CRT like this again, and it's super crazy to see the original styrofoam packaging here. One thing to note is the protective plastic is still on the front of the tube, and notice how clean the back of the tube and the PCBs are. These things are usually caked with dust and dirt from sitting in cabinets their entire lives, but this one has spent its entire life in this original box, and it's crazy to see that. Now that I've got the cabinet in the workshop, I'm going to start by stripping out all of the PC components and wiring. Next up, I'm going to remove the LCD monitor. Here you can see the original parts they had left in the cabinet. The Galaxian PCB is on the left and the original power board is at the bottom of the cabinet. I'm going to swap the power board with a modern switching power supply and replace the wiring harness with a standard Jama harness. A modern power supply just makes things a little bit easier, especially since I'm going to be running multiple Jama PCBs in this cabinet. The only wires I'm going to leave at this point are the 2 that are on the left side of the cabinet, and these run the power and audio up to the top marquee area. And the last thing to remove here is the iPAQ keyboard encoder, which was the piece that connected the controls to the PC. Now I'm going to pull out the board which was used to mount the LCD so I can modify it to fit the CRT. And all I really need to do here is cut a square CRT shaped hole in the center of it. Before I bolt the CRT to the board, I'm going to do a test fitting just to make sure all of the areas of the screen are visible from the front of the cabinet with the marquee in place, since sometimes that can overlap the screen area. Right here you can see me checking how the top of the board is bowing downwards a little bit, and it's probably totally fine, but I'm going to want to reinforce it just to be safe. And since everything looked good here, now I can proceed with bolting the CRT's mounting bracket to the board. Here, I'll slide the monitor board in again, and this time I'm going to securely bolt it into place. The board itself is only 1/2 inch plywood, and I probably should have used 3/4 inch. And at this point I didn't really want to make a trip to the hardware store, so I just decided to reinforce the board using a 2x4. And there we go, the CRT is now securely mounted in place. Next up is my most favorite part, which is working on the electrical. Here we have a Jama harness, Molex connectors, a switching power supply, and a Galaga to Jama adapter. These parts are all from arcadeshop.com. I'll pull off the rubber bands here and start combing through the wires to find the ones I need to work with first. I'm going to start with the wires that go to the coin door. This includes voltages for the LEDs as well as the switches on the coin validator. I like to use Molex connectors for all of these types of connections rather than hardwire them. It does take some extra time up front, but in the long run it saves a ton of time if I ever need to work on the machine later. Next up is the Molex connector for the power supply. This provides voltage to the game PCBs, as well as the LED on the coin door and marquee. And now we're going to do the wires for the control panel, which includes the joystick, fire button, and the 1 and 2 player start buttons. Before I'm done here, I'm just going to double check all of the continuity of the connections using a multimeter. If there's a problem, I'd rather find out now than when I've put the entire thing back together. Now I'm going to solder the video wires from the Jama harness to the harness that came with the CRT. And I'm not going to use an intermediary Molex connector here because the monitor's wiring harness is a quick disconnector itself. It just plugs into the monitor PCB. And it's time for one last continuity check. I just want to be sure that all the wires are going to the correct place on the Jama adapter, especially the power. I really don't want to risk frying a 40-year-old game PCB if the voltages are wrong or going to the wrong spots. And everything checked out, so we can go ahead and plug the Galaga board with the Jama adapter in and see if it powers on. Hey, look at that, nothing caught on fire. That is always a good sign. And if we go around to the front, yep, we can see the Galaga boot screen going. So it looks like we're good to go. On my cabinets, I like to add an external power switch. I'm using a double pole single throw switch, which is also known as a DPST switch. This is just a convenient way to turn the cabinet on and off without having to plug and unplug the power cord. And one reason I really like to use the HAP Pro power supplies is exactly because of this. They have a remote switch capability, which is just a Molex connector that I can plug this switch into. Switch is ready to go. On these Midway cabinets, I like to mount the switch on the top rear corner of the cabinet in the same place that the hand grip cutouts are. Now we can add the power supply into the cabinet and do some cable management. The Galaga PCB is actually two PCBs sandwiched together, and because of that, there aren't any free holes in the PCB to mount it to the cabinet. So I'm using a HAP universal PCB mount. Also, when the Jama adapter is connected to this board, there isn't enough clearance for the connectors on the sides of the cabinet, so I installed the PCB mount on a piece of plywood. Earlier in the video, I mentioned that I wanted to run both Galaxian and Galaga in this cabinet, and to be able to do that, I'm using a Jama Switcher. This is a PCB that allows you to switch between two different game PCBs without opening the cabinet or power cycling it. You just hold both player start buttons for a few seconds and it will switch between the games. Okay, now that that's taken care of, we can put the PCB back in the cabinet, and we can attach its Jama adapter to a harness and connect that harness up to the Jama switch. Alright, we're pretty close to being done. We just need to connect the Jama harness to the remaining components in the cabinet. Before I put the control panel back on, I'm going to build a bezel for the monitor. This bezel will just hide the CRT's mounting board so that all you see from the front of the cabinet is the CRT, the actual tube itself. I like to use this black photo board stuff, which you can find at Michael's or any other photo crafting store. And that's it, we're all done. So that was a quick look at how to convert a MAME cabinet back into a dedicated cabinet. I didn't want the video to be super long, so I didn't go super in-depth into any one step. But if you'd like to see more details, please let me know in the comments, and I can cover anything that you may want to see in a future video. I'll also leave links in the video description to my blog, which goes into more detail on the conversion process as well as the restoration, as well as links to all of the parts I used in the video in case you want to do something similar. But that's it for now. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.